At 5:09 on the morning of Sunday, 31 August 1997, Buckingham Palace issued a statement. 11 words. The Queen and the Prince of Wales are deeply shocked and distressed by the tragic news. That was the complete response. No national address, no announcement of public mourning, no acknowledgement that Diana's death was anything other than a family bereavement to be handled in the family's own time and on the family's own terms. The logic was consistent with Diana's formal status. She had not been Her Royal Highness since 28 August 1996, the day the divorce decree absolute was finalized and her title was stripped. She wasn't a working royal. She held no official patronages. She had no place in the line of succession. The night she died in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, her sole close protection officer, Trevor Rees-Jones, was an employee of Mohamed Al-Fayed, not a serving Metropolitan Police Royal Protection Officer. Under palace protocol, Diana in death was what she had been in the final year of her life, a private citizen with royal connections, not a member of the working royal family. So the palace treated her death the way its own logic demanded: a statement of shock, a planned return of the body, a ceremonial funeral to follow. The Queen and her family remained at Balmoral with William and Harry. No flag flew over Buckingham Palace. There was never one when the monarch wasn't in residence. All that was required, in the palace's initial operating assumption, was to manage the aftermath. Then the flowers started arriving. By Monday morning, the gates of Kensington Palace were already disappearing behind them. By Wednesday, mourners were queuing hundreds of yards outside St. James's Palace to sign condolence books, lines that stretched half a mile at their peak, waits of up to 12 hours. By the following Friday, the Los Angeles Times would report an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 tons of flowers carpeting the streets of London. 10,000 tons. Not placed by the palace's direction, not organized by any institution, placed by people who didn't ask permission and weren't waiting for any. The palace had misread what was coming. That much is beyond dispute. But to understand why it misread it, and why the error was something more systematic than bad public relations, you have to start 60 years earlier, with the woman who had done more than anyone else to build the palace operating system that failed so completely in that first week of September 1997. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became Queen of the United Kingdom on 11 December 1936, not because she sought the throne, but because her brother-in-law abandoned it. Edward VIII's abdication to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson was, for Elizabeth, a defining institutional trauma. She and her husband Albert, who became George VI, hadn't wanted the crown. They had 2 young daughters and a life that didn't require them to hold the center. Then Edward left, and the center needed holding. Scholars who have studied that period note that the Queen Mother's response was shaped by something close to institutional reaction formation. A Cambridge Journal of British Studies analysis is explicit. Her exaggerated view of her duty to the monarchy, not routine loyalty but something closer to a doctrine built from the specific shock of December 1936. The word duty echoed through accounts of that crisis. Duty abandoned by one brother, duty assumed reluctantly by the other. From that moment, the Queen Mother understood the monarchy's survival as contingent on the visible performance of institutional commitment, whatever the private cost. A royal who put personal desire above institutional obligation had nearly torn down what generations had constructed. That lesson would inform every decision she made for the next 65 years. She also understood quickly that the Crown's relationship with the public required careful and active management. Edward had been popular. His departure left residual sympathy and questions about whether his brother could carry the weight. The new monarchy emerging from 1936 needed to be rebuilt, not merely inherited. Then came the Blitz. Buckingham Palace was bombed 16 times during the Second World War. After one of the worst raids, the Queen Mother made a remark that became one of the most repeated phrases of her public life. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she said. "It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." When evacuation to Canada was on the table, the cabinet advised it, the logic was sound. She refused without hesitation. Her stated position? The children wouldn't go without her. She wouldn't leave the king, and the king would never leave. That refusal, and the phrase it produced, became the template for her model of monarchy. A crown that stayed visible, that shared what the public shared, and that managed its public image with the precision of a sustained performance. The optics of shared danger were calculated, and they were also genuine, which was precisely what made them work. She visited the bombed streets of the East End when she had been received with hostility on earlier visits. Her initial visits had provoked jeering, rubbish thrown at the royal car, hostility from people who resented the expense of her clothes while their homes burned. She kept going back. Norman Hartnell dressed her in gentle colors to represent, in his phrase, the rainbow of hope. Every detail was managed. Every detail was also believed. The writer Stephen Tennant caught this quality in a single observation, recorded in William Shawcross's official biography of the Queen Mother. She looked everything that she wasn't: gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil, she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. Tennant wasn't being unkind. He was describing, with some precision, a person who had learned that the royal surface was itself a form of governance. A Channel 5 documentary in 2001 used as its actual title a phrase widely attributed to her: "I'm not as nice as people think I am." Whether those exact words were hers isn't firmly established in any primary source. The portrait they suggest is consistent with everything that is. What is established is that after the death of Queen Mary in 1953, the Queen Mother became the effective matriarch of the British royal family, the figure who embodied continuity, who maintained the institutional memory, and who understood the crown's survival as something requiring active protection. At times when other royals attracted low public approval, she remained consistently popular. She was the institution's insurance policy. And she was absolutely convinced, by every lesson her life had taught her, that the monarchy's relationship with public emotion had to be managed from above. The public could be included. The public could be moved. But the terms of their inclusion were the institutions to set, not the crowds. That specific conviction, forged in 1936, tested in the Blitz, confirmed across 6 decades of careful public cultivation, shaped everything that followed. Lady Diana Spencer married Charles, Prince of Wales, at St. Paul's Cathedral on 29 July 1981. 750 million people watched on television. 600,000 lined the route. She was 20 years old, enthusiastically received by the royal family, including the Queen Mother, who was present when Charles courted Diana at Balmoral in 1980. Within 5 years, the marriage was visibly struggling. By 1987, the press had dubbed the couple the Glums. By 1992, Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, built on secretly recorded tapes of Diana herself, had made the extent of the breakdown public: eating disorders, suicide attempts, a marriage that had effectively ended years before anyone acknowledged it officially. The Queen described 1992 as her annus horribilis in a Guildhall speech that November. Charles and Diana separated that December, the Prime Minister announcing it to the House of Commons. Buckingham Palace, according to PBS Frontline, threatened to have Morton's book banned. But Diana's specific danger, within the worldview the Queen Mother had spent decades constructing, went beyond bad press. Diana had discovered that the public loved her more than the institution did. She had learned, with considerable precision, how to use that love as leverage. On 20 November 1995, she sat in her Kensington Palace sitting room in front of Martin Bashir's BBC Panorama cameras and delivered a 45-minute account of her marriage, her mental health struggles, and her sense of royal betrayal. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she told Bashir, referring to Camilla Parker Bowles. "So it was a bit crowded." She said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts, rather than a constitutional queen. She questioned whether Charles was suited to be king. Royal historian Katie Nicholl was direct about the institutional damage. Her casting doubt on Charles's ability to be a good king was hugely damaging to the institution. There is a fine balance between using TV as a medium to royal advantage and not letting too much daylight into the mystique of monarchy. The Queen could see it. On 20 December 1995, exactly 1 month after the broadcast, Buckingham Palace announced that the Queen had written to both Charles and Diana, advising them to divorce. As Nicholl observed, the Queen could see the damage it was causing to the monarchy as an institution. It was a case of Elizabeth II putting the reputation and preservation of the monarchy above all else. What Diana had done, in the institutional language of the palace, bore uncomfortable resemblance to what Edward VIII had done in 1936. She had put her own survival above what the institution required of her. She had made the private public. Unlike Edward, who had been neatly removed to the continent, Diana was still present, still visibly beloved, still capable at any moment of reaching a global audience. Where Edward had been a royal who violated duty by leaving, Diana violated it by staying, and by insisting, publicly and repeatedly, on being heard. The divorce decree absolute was issued on 28 August 1996. Diana lost the style Her Royal Highness that day. Her patronages were redistributed. Her place in the working royal family was formally ended. To the palace operating system the Queen Mother had spent her life constructing, the architecture was sound. The dangerous insider had been formally reclassified. What no one in that system had prepared for was the possibility that the public wouldn't accept the reclassification, that in grief, they would ignore the palace's paperwork entirely. Diana died at 4 in the morning on 31 August 1997 at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris from injuries sustained in the car crash. Dodi Fayed and driver Henri Paul also died. Trevor Rees-Jones, an Al-Fayed employee, not a Metropolitan Police officer, was the sole survivor. Prince Charles flew to Paris that same morning to accompany the body back to the United Kingdom. He returned to RAF Northolt that evening, Diana's coffin draped in the royal standard with an ermine border, transferred to a hearse in the glare of press cameras. Back in Scotland, hours before that flight, Charles had woken William and Harry to tell them their mother was dead. William was 15, Harry was 12. On Sunday morning, the Queen, Prince Philip, Charles, William, and Harry all wore black to the church service at Crathy Kirk near Balmoral. The congregation heard nothing from the pulpit about Diana. The royal family's first public presence after her death was a church service in Scotland, and a service in which the woman whose death was dominating every news broadcast in the world went unmentioned by the officiating clergy. The omission was noticed. It was reported. It was held against the palace for days. Back in London, the palace had announced a ceremonial funeral at Westminster Abbey for 6 September. The classification mattered. Ceremonial, not state. State funerals are reserved for sovereigns and, by specific grant, occasionally for prime ministers. Diana wasn't a working royal, held no HRH title, and was a divorced former wife of the heir to the throne. The protocol basis for the lower designation was real and legally consistent. To those already arriving at the gates of Kensington Palace with their flowers, it was irrelevant. Books of condolence opened at St. James's Palace on Monday, 1 September. The Queen and the royal family remained at Balmoral. The decision to stay in Scotland has been characterized by royal biographers, among them Robert Lacey, Penny Junor, and Sally Bedell Smith, as primarily family first. Charles and the Queen had 2 grieving boys, and Scotland offered distance from the media. That motivation was genuine, but it produced, from the outside, the appearance of an institution that had weighed the death of a woman loved by millions and concluded that its first obligation was to its own privacy. Tuesday brought a palace statement from Charles, William, and Harry together, saying they were taking strength from the public support and were deeply touched by and enormously grateful for it. It was warmer than the 11-word statement of Sunday morning. The Queen, however, had not spoken. No flag flew over the palace. The royal family had not appeared in London. By midweek, Princes Andrew and Edward were dispatched to Kensington Palace. Their purpose described in contemporaneous accounts as a precautionary measure to test the public mood. That framing is worth pausing on. While hundreds of thousands of people were grieving with apparent sincerity in the streets of London, the palace was sending junior royals to conduct a reconnaissance of how people were feeling. The country was in mourning. The institution was monitoring opinion. No flag flew over Buckingham Palace. The royal standard only flies when the monarch is in residence, and the Queen was at Balmoral. Under the protocol that had been in place for decades, there was simply nothing to raise or lower. No public statement came either, no acknowledgement from the Queen personally that what was happening outside the palace gates was different in kind from anything that had happened before. The plan that ultimately shaped Diana's funeral was literally the one prepared for someone else. Operation Tay Bridge was the code name for the Queen Mother's own long-rehearsed funeral arrangements, a plan that had been in development and rehearsal for 22 years. When a ceremonial plan was needed for Diana's funeral, Operation Tay Bridge was adapted as its basis. The palace's most prepared response to an unexpected royal death used the file it had been building since the mid-1970s for the institution's most senior figure. There is a certain institutional logic to that. There is also something in that specific detail that describes precisely the problem. A system designed for one kind of event, deployed to manage a completely different kind of event, because the palace had no other file to open. What is documented about the Queen Mother's role during those first 5 days is limited. She was 97 years old in September 1997, largely withdrawn from active governance, and no contemporaneous primary source records her giving specific instructions about how Diana's death should be handled. Her influence during those days is best described as structural and formative. She had built the culture that Elizabeth II operated within, and that culture's first instinct, consistently, was containment. What is documented is this: she was hugely upset. Not primarily about Diana's death, but about the public anger directed at her daughter, the Queen. The institution was under attack. The crown was being criticized. For a woman who had spent 60 years understanding criticism of the monarchy as an institutional emergency, the events of that week were something close to a personal crisis. The public, arriving at the gates in their hundreds of thousands, didn't know and didn't care. By Wednesday, 3rd September, newsreel footage captured what the palace had not been watching for. Thousands of mourners moving in orderly silence through the streets toward St. James's Palace, flowers in their arms. Queues stretching hundreds of yards from the gates. The lines were half a mile long at their peak. People waited up to 12 hours to sign one of 43 separate condolence books, opened across multiple locations to manage the volume. The silence of those queues is what contemporaries remarked on most. Not weeping, not protest, not the noise of a crowd conscious of being watched. Simply quiet. People standing for hours, many through the night. Members of the Women's Royal Voluntary Service and the Salvation Army worked through the darkness along the Mall, providing support to the overnight mourners, handing out hot drinks, standing alongside strangers who had nowhere else they wanted to be. By Thursday, the queue had been there for 3 consecutive days without letting up. What people were leaving at the gates wasn't just flowers. They left personal letters, addressed to Diana directly, photographs, teddy bears, bottles of champagne, cards with handwritten messages that palace staff, when the gates were eventually cleared, collected and delivered to Diana's family. The items were intimate in a way that official mourning protocols have no category for. Not tributes to a public figure from subjects keeping respectful distance, but messages from people who felt they were losing someone they actually knew. By 10 September, the pile of flowers outside Kensington Gardens had reached 5 feet deep in places. The bottom layer had already begun to compost. The smell, by that point, had become part of the atmosphere of that stretch of London. Not quite the scent of a garden, something more complex, sweetness and decomposition beginning to overlap. Fresh flowers were still being brought by the hour. More than 1 million bouquets at Kensington Palace alone. At her family's estate of Althorpe, the Spencer family had asked people to stop bringing flowers because the volume was creating a threat to public safety on the surrounding roads. The Los Angeles Times, reporting on 12 September, put the total floral tribute at an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 tons, a figure also recorded by Guinness World Records for the period between 1 and 8 September. These aren't round numbers inflated in later retellings. They are contemporaneous press estimates, and the closest thing the period has to an official count. Approximately 250,000 people queued to pay their respects during the week. The response wasn't without dissent. Elizabeth Wilson published a piece in New Left Review describing herself as baffled and deeply alienated by what she saw, noting that she could neither understand nor share the apparent outpouring of grief. Mass observation archive diaries from that week show a range of responses, not unanimous mourning, not a unified nation. But the dissent was quiet, and the flowers weren't. The Mourning for Diana, an edited academic volume compiled from that period, observed that major institutions, the media, the royal family, the church, the police, for once had no pre-planned script. What the public was doing outside the palace gates wasn't a performance organized by any institution. It was spontaneous, collective action at a scale that had no precedent in living British memory, and it was happening without the palace's involvement, guidance, or permission. Ipsos, then known as Mori, conducted a poll on 4 and 5 September. One of its documented questions asked directly, since her divorce from Prince Charles, did people think Diana had been badly treated by the royal family as a whole? Ipsos later noted that Diana's death received more media attention than any event in their measuring history, the biggest story, by resources deployed, the BBC had ever carried. The grief was a verdict. Tony Blair had already named it. On the morning of Sunday, 31st August, the same morning the palace issued its 11-word statement, Blair stepped outside the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Trimdon, County Durham, where he and his family had been attending morning service. He had prepared a statement on the back of an envelope, shaped in conversation with his Downing Street press secretary, Alistair Campbell. He was 4 months into his first term as Prime Minister, having won a May landslide that had fundamentally altered the political landscape the monarchy now had to navigate. He spoke about Diana's ability above all to identify with those who are suffering, and her special and wonderful place in people's hearts. He said, "We know how difficult things were for her from time to time. I am sure we can only guess that." Then, at the close, people everywhere, not just here in Britain, kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her. They loved her. They regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess, and that is how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and our memories forever. The phrase had first appeared in print in 1992, in a Julie Burchill article in the Modern Review, but its application on that Sunday morning, at that moment, by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was something qualitatively different from a magazine piece. It was a political act. It named, publicly and at the highest level of British government, the gap that had already opened between the palace's institutional response and the country's emotional reality. Blair later described the palace's initial reaction as, "All very by the book, but it took no account of the fact that people couldn't give a damn about the book." In his memoir, A Journey, he wrote that he tried to protect the monarchy, channel the anger before it became rage, and generally have the whole business emerge in a positive and unifying way rather than be a source of tension, division, and bitterness. His meeting with the Queen after Diana's death he described as difficult. He urged her to speak out, and later recalled, "She was trying to balance what she had to do as a queen and what she had to do as a grandmother." Alistair Campbell's diaries record that a senior official was dispatched from St. James's Palace to liaise with the Downing Street team. Blair reportedly traveled to Balmoral himself. The pressure wasn't gentle, and it wasn't coming only from the press and the public. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a man who had just won 418 parliamentary seats on a wave of public optimism, was arriving at the palace's door with a reading of the national mood that the institution had failed to register on its own. The specific phrase Blair deployed carried within it a quiet accusation that the monarchy, by treating Diana as no longer its own, had got the question of ownership exactly backwards. The people had claimed her. The institution had disclaimed her. The British public were insisting the monarchy submit to the people's will over Diana. Not because any institution had organized them, not because any authority had directed them, but because they had made a collective decision, in the absence of any direction, about what her life had meant and what her death required. The institution had 5 days to respond to that insistence. Its responses came one by one, each one a retreat from the position it had originally held. Among the specific complaints accumulating through the press in those 5 days was the absence of a flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace. The headlines framed it as a mark of royal indifference, the palace refusing to lower its colors for a woman the country was mourning at unprecedented scale. The protocol reality was more specific. The royal standard, the sovereign's personal flag, flies over Buckingham Palace only when the monarch is in residence. The Queen was in Balmoral. No flag flew because when the monarch was away, the flagpole was empty. The royal standard, additionally, is never flown at half-mast under any circumstances. The principle of monarchy holds that there is always a sovereign. When one dies, another immediately succeeds, so there is no vacancy requiring the lowered flag's signal of loss. The official royal family website states this directly. Unlike the Union flag, the royal standard is never flown at half-mast, even after the death of a monarch, as there is always a sovereign on the throne. Technically correct, disastrously insufficient. One persistent claim attached to this controversy deserves examination: that Diana's death was the first time a flag had been flown at half-mast in Britain for a notable death. That claim is wrong. In November 1963, following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, British flags were lowered across the country. The Coventry Telegraph carries historical photographs of the Union Jack flying at half-mast at the Hotel Leofric on 23 November 1963. Images of flags at the House of Commons at half-mast on 25 November 1963, the day of Kennedy's funeral, are part of the historical record. Kennedy wasn't a British subject. British flags came down anyway. The issue in 1997 was never whether a protocol for half-mast tribute existed. It plainly did, and it had been applied for the American president 34 years earlier. The issue was whether the palace understood that an empty flagpole was being read by the country as an empty gesture, that the absence of any visible symbol of mourning over the palace communicated, correctly or not, that the Crown didn't regard what was happening outside its gates as requiring acknowledgement. In response to that public pressure, the Queen ordered a break with protocol. and the Union flag was flown at half-mast over the palace on the day of Diana's funeral. Since Diana's death, the Union flag has flown from the palace when the monarch isn't in residence, a permanent protocol change that wouldn't have occurred without the pressure of that specific week. The palace had been running on a flag protocol inherited from before public accountability moved in real time. 5 days, and the institution changed a rule it had maintained for generations. Queen Elizabeth II was, throughout this crisis, the fulcrum. She wasn't acting on her mother's direct instructions during those 5 days. The Queen Mother at 97 wasn't issuing operational commands from Balmoral. The Queen was sovereign in her own right, and the decisions shaping the palace's initial response were consistent with the institutional culture she had operated within since 1952. A culture her mother had done more than anyone else to build. The decision to remain at Balmoral was, by consistent biographical account, first and foremost about William and Harry. At the time, my grandmother wanted to protect her 2 grandsons and my father as well, William said years later. Prince Philip, characteristically direct, had pushed back hard on early suggestions that the boys should walk behind their mother's coffin in the funeral procession. They've just lost their mother. You're talking about them as if they are commodities. The boys were 12 and 15. Their father had woken them before dawn on Sunday morning. Scotland offered distance, and distance offered some measure of shelter from what London was becoming. The concern for the boys was real. Biographers characterized the decision consistently as family first, but institutionally tone-deaf. The motivations were human and parental, but the effect was to make a reigning monarch invisible at exactly the moment the country needed to see her. Every day without a public address from the Queen became its own headline. The palace's silence, originally justified by protocol and parental instinct, was being amplified by each news cycle into evidence of royal coldness. By 4 September, the newspapers were explicit in their criticism. Blair had pressed his case. Campbell's diaries record that communication between Downing Street and the palace was active and direct. The pressure wasn't gentle. The Queen returned to London from Balmoral on Friday, 5 September, a day earlier than originally planned. Before leaving Scotland, she and Prince Philip went to view the floral tributes that the public had laid on the Balmoral estate, standing among the flowers in the Scottish autumn light. Charles and his sons returned to London on the same day, making an unannounced visit to see the tributes outside Kensington Palace. At 6 o'clock that evening, from the Chinese dining room at Buckingham Palace, the Queen addressed the nation live. Not recorded and edited. Live. That distinction carries weight. Live broadcast is exposure that can't be controlled after the fact, and its use signaled a willingness to be present on terms the palace had not set itself. Her documented words, preserved on the official royal family website. Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen, throughout Britain and around the world, an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death. She spoke, she said, as your queen and as a grandmother. I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her, for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her 2 boys. No one who knew Diana will ever forget her. Billions of others who never met her, but felt they knew her, will remember her. The language is formal, but the admissions are real. An overwhelming expression of sadness acknowledged that the public response had exceeded the palace's framework. As your queen and as a grandmother was simultaneously an institutional concession and a human reckoning, perhaps the most rhetorically honest sentence the Queen had delivered in public in years. Academic analysts of the broadcast have described it as image repair discourse, but image repair in this specific context wasn't cynical. It was an institution acknowledging, publicly, that its first 5 days had been insufficient. The walkabout followed. The Queen stopped to speak with mourners outside Buckingham Palace, accepting flowers, meeting the crowd at something closer to its own level than any royal protocol would normally permit. On the morning of the funeral, the Union Jack was raised at half-mast. Step by step, in the 6 days between 31st August and 6 September, the palace had retreated from every position it had initially taken. The retreat wasn't elegant. It was extracted. Saturday, 6 September 1997. The tenor bell of Westminster Abbey began tolling at 9:08 in the morning to signal the departure of the cortege from Kensington Palace. Diana's lead-lined coffin, its weight 1/4 of a ton, was carried from the palace on a gun carriage by riders of the King's troop, draped in the royal standard with an ermine border. 3 wreaths of white flowers sat on top, one from her brother, one from William, one from Harry. Beside Harry's wreath was a sealed envelope. It was addressed, in a child's handwriting, to Mummy. 8 members of the Welsh Guards accompanied the coffin on the 1-hour, 47-minute ride through London. At St. James's Palace, Prince Philip joined the procession on foot. So did Charles, her 2 sons, and Earl Spencer. Philip had initially opposed the idea of William and Harry walking in the cortege. He thought it too much to ask of grieving children. Eventually, he made them an offer. He would walk if they would walk. William later described the experience as one of the hardest things I've ever done. Harry said no child should be asked to do what they did, but was glad he went through with it. More than 1 million people lined the streets of London. Flowers rained down onto the coffin as the gun carriage moved. The crowds were largely silent, standing, many of them with their arms at their sides, watching. Some wept, some simply stood. The silence wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of people who had already spent 5 days processing something that had taken the palace 5 days to begin to acknowledge. The coffin passed Buckingham Palace, where the royal family stood waiting outside. Queen Elizabeth II bowed her head as it went by. 2,000 people attended inside Westminster Abbey. The British television audience was 32.1 million, approximately 59% of the entire British population at the time. Worldwide, an estimated 2.5 billion people watched across 180 countries. The broadcast went out in 44 languages. By audience, it remains one of the most watched live broadcasts in recorded history. The funeral was classified as ceremonial rather than state. That distinction, which had carried real institutional weight in the palace's planning, was practically invisible to every one of those 2.5 billion viewers. The ceremony included things the palace had not designed. Elton John performed a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind. The original 1973 song had been a tribute to Marilyn Monroe. Bernie Taupin rewrote the lyrics specifically for Diana, opening with Goodbye, England's Rose. The decision to include John wasn't automatic. Files released by the National Archives showed that the Dean of Westminster, Wesley Carr, had personally appealed to senior palace aides to secure the performance, insisting on the inclusion of something of the modern world that the princess represented. A solo saxophonist had been the alternative under consideration. The Dean got Elton John. The resulting single sold 33 million copies worldwide. Then came Earl Spencer. Charles Spencer, Diana's brother and the 9th Earl Spencer, delivered the eulogy. His address didn't soften its positions for the occasion. He described Diana as someone who needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic. He pledged his protection of William and Harry in language the Abbey, and the crowds outside it, received as a direct challenge to the institution's approach, a promise to raise them not in the image of inherited obligation, but in the image of their mother, the person who had loved them without condition. It's a point to remember. Spencer said. That of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this. A girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age. When Spencer finished, the guests inside Westminster Abbey began to applaud. Protocol at a funeral address in that space dictated none. The applause came anyway, starting somewhere toward the back of the nave and moving forward, uncertain at first, then unmistakable. It traveled from inside the Abbey into Hyde Park, where crowds had gathered around large outdoor screens, watching and listening through speakers that the palace itself had arranged. The sound moved outward until it was audible beyond the Abbey walls. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had given permission. The public had decided what Spencer's words deserved, and they expressed it at volume, inside one of the most protocol-governed spaces in British civic life. The coffin was driven to Althorpe afterward. Mourners cast flowers along almost the entire length of the journey. On the opposite carriageway of the M1 motorway, drivers pulled over and stopped their vehicles as the hearse passed. The ceremony's final image, collectively, wasn't of an institution in command. It was of an institution that had been overtaken by events and had found itself, at the last, hosting a reckoning it had not planned and couldn't conclude on its own terms. The Queen Mother lived until 30th of March 2002, aged 101. She outlasted Diana by 4 years and 7 months. The evidence for what she specifically felt or decided during the week of Diana's death is limited, and the argument doesn't depend on it being anything else. Her influence on those events wasn't exercised through instruction. It was exercised through formation, through the institutional culture she had built over 6 decades, which the Queen and the palace's senior staff operated within as a matter of course, because it had worked reliably for so long. That culture held that the monarchy managed the terms of its relationship with the public. The Crown decided when to appear, how to appear, what to acknowledge, and what to classify as private. The public participated on the institution's terms. That arrangement had been enforced successfully since 1936. The abdication had tested it. It held. The wartime years had tested it. It held. The annus horribilis had tested it. It held. Diana's life had tested it. The Morton book, the panorama interview, the divorce. And the palace had managed the aftermath, formally and legally, by reclassifying her as a private citizen. The grief of September 1997 didn't accept the reclassification. What Diana had built, what the Queen Mother's institutional framework had no category for, was a form of public attachment that operated entirely outside the palace's permission structure. The HRH title had been removed. The patronages had been redistributed. The protocol had been satisfied in every technical sense. None of it mattered in the slightest to the 10,000 tons of flowers, the 12-hour queues, the 2.5 billion television viewers, the applause spreading through Westminster Abbey against every rule of the occasion. The palace's operating system had been built on the premise that emotional sovereignty over the national relationship with the Crown belonged to the Crown. What September 1997 demonstrated was that premise had ceased to be true, and that the distance between the palace's assumption and the country's reality had grown, unnoticed, to the width of a gulf. The British public were insisting the monarchy submit to the people's will over Diana. That wasn't a demand being made by a political party, or a movement, or any organized force. It was a collective decision, made without coordination by the millions who arrived at the gates, who stayed in the queues, who watched the funeral, who stood silent on the M1 motorway with their vehicles stopped. They had decided what her life had meant. They had decided what her death required. They had decided, without asking, that the palace would answer to that verdict rather than the reverse. The Queen's broadcast on 5th September, the return from Balmoral, the walkabout, the flag, none of these were acts of understanding. They were acts of submission. The palace had not finally come to comprehend what Diana had meant to the country. It had been forced, over 5 days of unrelenting public pressure, to respond to a power it had no name for and no protocol to handle. The monarchy submitted. The crowd had outranked the crown. And the funeral the palace had staged, adapted bureaucratically from the Queen Mother's own long-prepared final arrangements, became, in the event, something the institution had not built and couldn't control. The largest public reckoning with royal authority in the 20th century, and the moment an operating system that had served the crown for 60 years finally ran out of answers. Subscribe for more stories like this.